welcome Jack Nelson Pallmeyer. He is well known in the Twin Cities in peace circles, I would say. He's an assistant professor, associate professor?
Associate professor.
At St. Thomas, University of St. Thomas. He has written many books. He is an author and a preacher and a teacher. And my take always is that I'm going to let him have the better part of the hour, and he can certainly tell us whatever he wants to about himself and his history and his background. But please welcome Jack Nelson Pallmeyer.
All right. Nice to see you all. I thought I wanted to start out and tell you one story from my background. It's actually a pretty serious story that would explain why am I here and why am I going to say the kinds of things I'm going to say. Actually took root about 40 years ago when I was an undergraduate student at St. Olaf College, traveling in India, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Japan, Israel, Palestine, a number of places as an undergraduate student. And our group was supposed to be spending a month in India, but the United States and India were fighting at the time, were feuding at the time. Turns out the U.S. was backing a repressive dictator in Pakistan. Some things don't change, right? We have this long kind of history of doing these things. And of course, I knew nothing about this. But our group of 28 students, we got caught up in international politics, right? And the Indian government, in response to their feud with the United States, said that we could not spend a month in India. So that meant we had to try to figure out what were we going to do. We ended up spending a month in Sri Lanka, but the Indian government did give us permission to land in India, spend a night there, and then we had to get out. So, this is the story. We arrive in Bombay, India. Now I guess Mumbai, but called Bombay. Pretty late at night. We get in an old rickety school bus, and I remember explicitly where I was sitting, the front right of the bus, looking out the window. And as I'm looking out the window, or the windows, I see dozens, hundreds, thousands of people getting ready for bed between the roadways. Only they don't have homes and they don't have beds. I'm coming off of, in Ethiopia, I lost 30 or 35 pounds in a month. I was sick the entire time I was there. So I'm kind of weak physically, emotionally. This is a very different world than Coon Rapids, Minnesota. And I'm just, I don't know, just kind of being torn up by the depth of poverty that I'm seeing. And the bus continues on. We get interrupted as we get into the downtown area. We get interrupted by a religious procession that's coming by. So the bus stops. And I look out the window, and as close to Gale it is for me now, there's a woman dead on the straight lane, right on the street, and a little tiny girl screaming at the top of her lungs. And we sat there, it's stuck in this traffic for what seemed like an eternity, and then finally the bus jolts forward. We move into a little bit further into the downtown area, and we come to a luxury hotel surrounded by squalor. We're ushered in off the bus by armed guards, and awaiting us inside is a feast. You know, nice tablecloths, all kinds of china, more silverware than I know what to do with. They have an orchestra playing, and I just feel sick. I don't want to be there, I don't want to eat. I pushed my way past the armed guards out on the street and spent most of the night walking the streets of Bombay. Really dumb thing to do. The kind of thing you don't tell your mom about until you get home safely, right? But I remember that really changed me a lot. That experience was a foundational part of a change. And I remember thinking, as I got back to the hotel and met up with the other students and got on the bus and we went to Sri Lanka, I remember thinking that this luxury hotel, surrounded by squalor and armed guards, was a perfect metaphor for our world. And I didn't want to live in that world. I wanted to change that world. And I also knew that because of the accident of my birth, there was a room prepared for me in that hotel. And I could have chosen just to enter it and stay there and live there comfortably. But I didn't want to do that either, because I knew I couldn't make it on the street. I didn't think anybody else should have to. So I tell you this story about this idea that comes into my head and my heart that we live in a very divided world, and militarism protects the injustice of that world. That would be one of my contentions. So now, to frame this conversation about this organization that I've helped found, an effort that I've helped found called the Minnesota Arms Spending Alternatives Project. And if you're perceptive, you get ASAP in our acronym, which means as soon as possible, we've got to be making this transition away from our spending priorities on wasteful Pentagon spending, destructive wars, the needs of a military-industrial complex that are disconnected from the real security needs of the country, and we've got to do it now. In fact, the way I would phrase this, the way I think about this, is we're really facing, I think, a planetary emergency. And except for we're not facing it. We're kind of sleepwalking through a planetary emergency. And what I would like to suggest, and this is, I wrote a book about a lot of the topics I'm going to touch on today. It's called Authentic Hope, and I brought a few here. And the subtitle is, It's the End of the World as We Know It, but soft landings are possible. And I believe that. I believe that soft landings, meaning we can make a transition away from the roads that we're on, away from the pathways we're on, and we can, I believe, the great challenge is, can we improve the quality of life for present and future generations while dramatically lessening our ecological footprint? That's our big challenge. And I believe the answer is yes, we could. But the answer is also no, we can't as long as we stay on the pathways we're on. And another way of saying this is, I believe that there are solutions to many of the problems that we face as a country, as a community, as a world, but there aren't military solutions to the problems we face as a country, a community, or a world. So here's part of, again, background. I just want to touch on, here's the 5 converging factors that lead me to say it's the end of the world as we know it. Nothing we can do is going to preserve that old world that we think is normal and that we tend to project into the future about what life is like. It's not going to work that way because of these 5 converging factors. That doesn't mean that the world is ending. And in fact, part of what I'm going to try to scream out loud in my friendly way is that I think in the midst of these really incredible crises are incredible opportunities to improve quality of life for present and future generations while dramatically lessening our ecological footprint. Okay, so here's the 5, very quickly, the 5 factors that make up our context. Number 1, I won't say much about it, climate change. That's part of the planetary emergency, and I think if there's one thing that positive that comes out of this bizarre couple of years, and the bizarre weather patterns, and the incredible droughts, and the floods happening not only in our country but worldwide, is I think it has actually broken through a little bit of the ideological barrier that says climate change is a hoax. I think it's opened up a little bit of space, a little bit of awareness, but that's a huge one. And I have to be honest here, in my writing about this, when I talk about climate change, I shift my language. And I say it's the end of the world as we know it, but soft landings may be possible. We really don't know. We don't know how close we are to tipping points. We don't know exactly how this is going to unfold. What we do know is that it's really, really vital that we act boldly. There are lots of alternatives we can be pursuing. Okay, second kind of converging factor is related to the first, or at least climate change is related to the second one I'm going to name, and that is that our economic systems and our ideas about the economy are completely disconnected from ecology. Okay? This idea that somehow the economy is separate from the health of the air, the water, coming to terms with the fact that we live on a finite planet with lots of creativity and lots of innovation possible, but we still live on a finite planet. And we're approaching our economic system through a very, very destructive lens. On the hopeful side, I was very pleased as I was writing this book on authentic hope to discover that in Great Britain, they actually appointed a government commission. And the government commission was asked to look into whether the growth assumptions of the world and British and other economies was it all realistic, that growth assumption? And they came back and said, no, absolutely not. There's just no way that we can project into the future the kind of resource use that we're even now doing. And when we add on to the fact that we're going to continue growing in population and demand and other things, no, it's not realistic. I'll give you one example. They pointed out that if by 2050, the world's 9 billion people at that point had European lifestyles or lifestyles as resource intensive as in Europe today. And keep in mind, European lifestyles are 50% less resource intensive than ours. Okay? So we're talking about a European lifestyle for all the world's people. Then the carbon intensity in the atmosphere would be 55 times greater than it is today. 55 times greater than it is today, and the climate scientists are telling us we're already we got to be scaling down from the carbon that's in the atmosphere. If we allow, and you can hear any politician, it can be Republican, can be Democrat, doesn't matter, and most politicians around the world, they all see the solution to our economic problems as what? Growth. Exactly. So they said, if we allow a 2% growth rate in our calculation, then the carbon intensity will be 130 times greater than it is today. And they just said, there's absolutely no possibility that that's going to solve our problems. So, economics disconnected from ecology. So this isn't the topic of today, but I want to throw it out because it's really, really important. And that is, part of our task is to re-envision what the purpose of the economy is. And my simple statement is, in the future, and this is actually quite hopeful, I think, the purpose of the economy is to provide a material foundation sufficient for a meaning-based society. That's going to be the purpose of economics, to provide the material foundation, the food, the clothing, the healthcare, the essentials, to provide that basis, that foundation for a meaning-based society. And again, the reason I say that this is good news is that there's so much evidence that just shows that gross domestic product growing is not connected to well-being or happiness. I mean, think about in your own lives, if I were to ask you what makes you happy and content and excited, most of you would talk about family, you talk about relationships, you might talk about music and art and theater, none of those things are resource intensive. What they are is great gifts that enhance quality of life. And so we're going to need to make that transition. Okay, a third converging point here. And all these connect to the topic of militarization, so I'm going to get there. But the third one is we've reached the point, past the point of tolerating the kind of inequalities that we have in terms of economic benefits that flow from the economy. So you are probably aware, I hope you are, that the United States is the most unequal of all the developed countries. You are probably aware that there is enormous inequality within our country. Last year, 93% of the income gains of the country went to the richest 1%. The Occupy movement is exactly right in pointing out how unequal we've become. Okay? And worldwide, I'll just give you one stat. The 3 richest people in the world have assets greater than the combined gross domestic products of the 48 poorest countries. Now think about that. 3 people in the world, their assets are greater than the combined gross domestic products of the 48 poorest countries. So that level of injustice, that level of inequality is absolutely unsustainable. Now again, I got to deliver a little bit of good news with this analysis. And the good news is that there are so many benefits that flow from greater equity. And in fact, all kinds of studies have been done, and I cite many of them in my book, that if if you want one correlative factor, one factor closely linked to every social problem we can name in this country, it's inequality. Stated positively, the more equitable a society, when you have equity, you have higher life expectancy. Where you have equity, you have lower infant mortality, lower prison population, less punitive prison practices, less obesity, less out-of-wedlock birth. Every social indicator that you would, life expectancy, all those things, health, the basic health of the people. Here's one stat that really stood out to me in one of the studies I cited. The poorest person in Norway lives on average longer than the richest person in the United States. And what's interesting about that is they say most of us, if we have any awareness, we say inequality is bad for the poor. But what all the studies show is that inequality is bad for everybody, because you undermine the trust and the social fabric that is necessary for a healthy society. So again, lots of good ways that we can go, but we're on these dead-end roads that aren't taking us there. Okay, the fourth one, which is the most depressing one for me, is we're at this point now where all these problems exist, but we have both political parties that are out to lunch in terms of national leadership. Now, I'm not saying there's no difference. I'm sure everybody in this room has their opinions. They're all valid opinions. I'm not telling you not to vote. I'm not telling you it doesn't matter what happens in Washington. But what I am telling you is something similar to what Jeffrey Sachs, the mainstream economist, when he spoke at the forum at the church in downtown Minneapolis recently, he said, our political leaders are essentially in the pockets of very powerful groups. And the way he said it was, he said, the Republicans are owned, he said, by the energy industry, and he said the Democrats are owned by the finance industry. And my addendum is that the energy industry also rents Democrats, and the finance industry rents Republicans. And so the problem we have with our political system right now is that laws have been put in place. We have inertia that helps explain why we have so much inequality, helps explain why we have so much money going into the military sector. And once you have systems in place, then a politics of no works really well, because you can just lobby and buy off enough politicians of the other party and join them with your group, and you block meaningful reforms. So we're at a stage, and this is going to be very important to why I think this project that I'm involved with called the Arms Spending Alternatives Project is so important, is because I think if any of us in this room have the idea that our solutions are going to come in the present moment from our political leaders in Washington, I think that's wrong. I think if we, again, I'm not telling you to ignore that arena. In fact, I would tell you, get involved in that arena, do what you can in that arena, but don't put all your eggs in that basket, because we have some very big structural problems that limit that arena from being a very effective arena. Okay, you can, if you want. If I need to clarify that more than I have, I'm glad to do that. All right, so now we're getting to the fifth one. And the fifth one is that U.S. militarization is killing the planet. It's killing the future. I literally mean when I say U.S. militarization. We are responsible. It is us. The United States dominates space. In fact, there was a vote in the United Nations a few years ago to keep space for peaceful purposes. The vote was 166 to 1. We rejected it. We're racing in the words of our official documents, own space, control space, dominate space, deny space to others. We control the seas. We control the airwaves. The United States has 1,000 or more military bases outside of our borders. No other country has probably more than 2. We control every aspect of conventional weaponry. We dominate. And you know what? It's absolutely useless. Because everywhere we go and everywhere we militarize, what we're doing is we're hitting hornets' nests, and then we get stung, and there's all this feedback, and then we fail, and so then we hit more hornets' nests, and we militarize more, and we increase the budget, and we ramp up the fear, and we militarize some more, and we keep this up, and it gets worse and worse. It's a spiral of an empire spiraling towards decline. Now, I'm not mincing my words here at all, because I think it is so urgent for us to recognize that we are living in the most militarized country in the history of the world, and we don't even know it. We don't even know it. We don't see it. We don't see how it's taken over, I would say, even our minds. When have you heard an intelligent conversation at the national level from our political leaders about the fact that every time we militarize, we accelerate the pace of our internal decline? Other people see it. In fact, there's a French historian who's famous in Europe for having predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. He said everybody was looking at their military powers, and I was looking at their society, I was looking at their economy, I was looking at how they were unraveling from within, and he makes the same prediction for the United States of America. Every time we militarize a problem, every time we spend way more money than we need in the military sector, we are accelerating the pace of our internal decline, and we are blocking the necessary resources from being devoted to addressing this incredibly possible, hopeful, needed transition to a livable world and to a society of greater justice. So here's just a few statistics I want you to think about. I almost went bald with telling my barber what I was working on. He got so interested. He said, "Jack, what are you working on?" I said, this was not this time. I did get my hair cut last week, but it was much shorter, I can tell you. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm still teaching at St. Thomas, and I love that." And I said, "I've been working on this arm spending alternatives project." I said, "Jim," and I'll update the figures now, but I said, "Jim, do you know that we just shut down our state over a $5 billion two-year shortfall?" He said, yeah, really, really crummy. And I said, "Do you know that over that same two-year period, Minnesota taxpayers spent $8.4 billion just for our share of Iraq and Afghanistan, and another $16 billion for our share of wasteful Pentagon spending that has effectively doubled since the collapse of our enemy, the Soviet Union." And he said, "Jack, every person in Minnesota needs to hear that, needs to know that, because if people knew that," he said, "I think many of them will demand something different." The latest example of fear being used to motivate us to turn over our lives, turn over our wealth, turn over our resources, to what Dwight Eisenhower called a military-industrial complex. And you remember that speech, right? Most of you are familiar with this speech. What he was telling us, when in that speech, he was saying that our democracy was in trouble, right, because of this concentrated, unwarranted influence. And he was telling us that soon, or maybe even then now, and certainly it's true today, that military spending levels and even the wars we would fight were now disconnected from the actual defense needs of the country. They were being driven by interests, not by security, not by actual defense. And that's where we're at. I don't know how many of you, any of you get the, I know this is a St. Paul, or you're in St. Paul, but any of you get the Star Trip? Okay, many of you do. You probably saw, I think it was Saturday's paper or Friday's paper. I think it was Friday's paper. Front page article, and it said Minnesota may lose 4,000 jobs, and if you read the article, it talked about maybe losing up to, I think, $330 or $350 million a year in economic activity over the next 9 years. And if we have cuts to the military budget, okay, right? Many of you saw this. So I just did the calculation in my head, and I think I can multiply it well enough that this is pretty close. That Minnesota, so we're worried about over 9 years losing about $3-point-some billion in economic activity in the state. And that, that's not, you shouldn't just dismiss that as being unimportant. So that's about $3 billion over 9 years. Do you know what Minnesota's contribution to the Pentagon budget will be over those same 9 years? $1.4 trillion. Minnesota taxpayers are going to spend $1.4 trillion over the next 9 years just for wasteful, most of it wasteful military spending. Now, keep in mind, when I'm talking here, the budgets I'm quoting you do not include veterans benefits. In my view, we have a duty not to glorify war and not to idealize soldiers, but we do have a responsibility to take care of the soldiers who come back with all kinds of physical, emotional, and other needs. Okay, I hope I stated that as clearly as I can. So, article mentioned none of this, right? None of this. We're gonna lose, 3-point-some billion dollars in economic activity. We can't cut the military budget. Meanwhile, all the studies show that when you spend $1 billion in the military, it's one of the worst job creators you could ever do. If you spend it in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure, in wind power and solar, you create far more jobs, far more economic activity. And further, if you cut non-military spending, you eliminate far more jobs and you have a far more negative impact on the quality of life in your society.
Yes.
None of that made it into the article because, I believe, we live in such a militarized mindset that it doesn't even enter the public debate. And anyone who is saying what I do is in risk of being called unpatriotic, un-American, not concerned with the security of the United States, out to lunch, etc., etc. So there's a fear factor on many levels. I want to say something about Iran, and then I'll say something specific about what we're doing in this project. Iran is another case in point. In this book, again, and you don't have to buy the book, but you can get it out of the library or put one in your library or do something. But in this book, I went through a number of documents. I won't go into all kinds of detail, but basically, it was a document written in September 2000 that laid out what the neoconservatives that ended up leading us into the Iraq War, most of them ended up in the Bush administration in foreign policy circles. They called it America's grand strategy. And it was a grand strategy by which the United States could achieve a kind of permanent global domination because Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, we had a lot of military power, we could use it, we should use it, and we could have these great outcomes. Okay? Didn't work out quite so well, but this was their idea. Now this is what they said in this document about nukes. First thing they said, countries who want to get nuclear weapons do so because they see it as a deterrent to prevent the United States from invading them. That's why countries want to get a nuclear weapon. Second, they said, it's a very effective strategy. Third, they said, we can't allow it. So we're going to destabilize and overthrow governments that attempt to get nuclear weapons as a deterrent to our capacity to intervene. And fourth, they said, we need to modernize our nuclear weapon systems, we need to develop a new generation of usable nukes, and we need to militarize space with nuclear weapons. Now, does that just, if I gave you if you all love pie, and I give you a crumb, and I give you half the pie and you the other half of the pie, what are you going to say?
I want yours.
Yeah, or that's not fair, right? It's not fair. Not fair. Yeah, we all recognize double standards unless it comes to American exceptions, which we're all seeked in. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, we can, okay, let's go home depressed? No, don't go home depressed. I think that in this particular historical moment, in the country and in the state of Minnesota and in our communities, we have an opportunity to talk to people who we don't normally talk to about issues related to the high costs of wasteful Pentagon spending and unnecessary wars. And the entry is, in every community, at every level of government, we have reduced governance to managing austerity. What do we elect people to do? Not to improve your community, to manage austerity in the ways that they deem as most appropriate or that protects the groups that they're most interested in protecting. They're all managing austerity. What that also means is that every community in the state is wrestling with something like they're closing our library, or they're cutting our library hours, or they just laid off the librarian, or we just cut firefighters, we just cut police. Our class sizes are getting bigger. Our schools have eliminated physical education. We no longer have art and music. We can't afford those things. We've got bridges falling down. Well, we'll do some repairs, but we're going to have to wait on these other ones. We have an aging infrastructure under the ground in terms of water systems. Well, you know, we're going to have to play that out for about 5 more years because we're going to have to stretch it out as long as we can. I mean, you can go on, you can fill in your own blank about where the concern is, but I can guarantee you in every community in this state, people are worried about the quality of their lives eroding around them. And yet they are completely or nearly completely unaware that this country last year spent 59 cents out of every dollar Congress voted on. They control the budget. They control the discretionary budget. 59 cents out of every dollar that Congress appropriated went to war. And that's not counting the veterans budget. And in the budget cuts to come, here there is a little bit of a difference. The Republicans want to take all that money that we're going to cut to deal with a deficit we shouldn't have to have, and they're going to take it out of that small sector of discretionary spending that isn't military spending. And the Democrats, they want a more balanced approach, but they're not going to tackle the big issues that I just laid out. So what we're doing in this Minnesota Armed Spending Alternatives Project, and if any of you, I assume many of you have access to the computer, you can just go, in fact, I'll just send these around. I brought, I think, enough copies. This is a copy of a resolution, a sample resolution, that we're bringing to city councils, to churches. This church should pass our resolution, to library boards, to school boards. We just, I don't know how many of you get the St. Paul paper? Okay, a few of you. Did you see that the St. Paul City Council last week unanimously approved our resolution calling for a shift in federal priorities from spending on war to meeting community needs. So that's actually the first city council in the state that has done that. This is a new effort that we're doing. Minneapolis City Council, we hope will take this up hopefully this month, maybe not till after the election. Duluth City Council, we've got efforts underway in Mounds View, in Eagan, in Apple Valley, in Lino Lakes, a number of places where this is happening. And the idea, again, isn't just to quietly pass a resolution. The idea is to use the resolution as a way of having a conversation. And this is the last thing that I'll say, then I'll open it up to your questions. My view, which may be wrong, again, is that in some ways, we're at a pre-Washington stage bringing about change. In a way, I think that was one of the powerful messages of Occupy. The Occupy movement was essentially saying, what do you do when we don't have a listening partner? You know, everybody said Occupy, well, you got to make specific demands. Occupy was saying, who do we make the demands to? We have this intersection of money and politics. We don't have a demand partner. Well, if you don't have a demand partner, or in my language right now around this issue, we have a problem that is much deeper than policy. It's a problem of values and vision. And it's a problem rooted in a culture of war, in a culture of American exceptionalism, in a culture in which violence has become a belief system. Militarism is a belief system of the usefulness of military power to solve problems. If that's our problem, then we need conversations. We need interaction. We need more than just a policy change. We have a lot of fundamental work to do. And I would argue, as a Christian, that the church should be playing a major role in this planetary emergency of bringing about the shift, not only in policy, but also in values and consciousness. And I think in my sermon today, I'm going to talk about some of the parallels between how Rome ruled and how the U.S. ruled. And one of the ways that Rome ruled is it cultivated and required religious complicity in its imperial system. We can't afford to be religiously complicit at a time when we're facing a planetary emergency. So you can get involved in this in all kinds of ways. You can individually endorse the resolution. You can have committees of your church endorse the resolution. You can have the church council endorse the resolution. I would like you all to go home today and make a list of all the organizations that you're a part of, that you give money to, that you are connected to in any way. And I want you to lay out a plan for how you're going to bring this resolution to each of those organizations. And we'd be glad to help you. To contact Minnesota ASAP. We have a staff person. We're a very low budget. If you want to give us money, we can always use money. The money I get for being here today is going to go into Minnesota ASAP. It doesn't go to me. All kinds of ways that you can be involved. And I feel like things are just starting to take off. The Philadelphia City Council just voted overwhelmingly demanding a shift, demanding an end to these wars and a shift in priorities. We've got groups in Oregon who heard about what we're doing, and now they're organizing an Oregon equivalent to Minnesota ASAP. We've got inquiries coming in from all over the state now of people wanting to get engaged in it. So we're just, after a year of planting seeds, they're just starting to flower, and you could help raise that plant. If we're ever going to change what happens in Washington, we're going to have to build a grassroots movement and initiative in what we do. One of the things I like to say is there is no hope without honesty, and there's probably not much honesty without hope. That hope is not a ledger sheet. You know, if I were to wake up every morning and make a list, and especially if I read the paper, you know, and just put all the things that make me kind of hopeless over on one side, and then the ones that make me hopeful on the other side, and that's how I decided whether I was hopeful or not, it would probably be a pretty bleak picture. Hope, for me, is a decision that we make about how to live. It's a decision we make every day to live authentic lives, to live as we think we should live. There's a wonderful quote. Maybe I will take the time to read this. It's from Howard Zinn, my favorite historian. And he has this great quote. He says, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifices, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act and at least the possibility of sending the spinning top of the world in a different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future." I love this part. "The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory." To live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory.